The silence of the Appalachian foothills is rarely absolute. Usually, there is the rustle of dry leaves, the call of a hawk, or the distant hum of a highway. But in this specific corner of Columbia County, Pennsylvania, the silence feels heavy, as if the landscape itself is holding its breath. Here, the asphalt of Route 61 doesn't just end, it fractures. It buckles under the pressure of something invisible, its surface scarred by deep fissures that release a rhythmic, ghostly pulse of white vapor. To a passing traveler, it looks like fog. To those who know the history of this place, it is the breath of a subterranean monster that has been exhaling for over 60 years. This is Centralia, a town that, for all intents and purposes, has been erased from the map, yet refuses to be extinguished. The story of Centralia is often told as a simple cautionary tale of human error, a trash fire gone wrong. But when you peel back the layers of local records, geological surveys, and the conflicting testimonies of those who were there, the simplicity vanishes. The fire that still burns beneath the earth today is not just a geological anomaly, it is a historical mystery. For decades, the official narrative has pointed to a single afternoon in May 1962. Yet, there are voices, documented in the margins of town hall minutes and old newspaper archives, that suggest the disaster may have been inevitable, or perhaps that the fire had already been waiting for its moment to emerge. But to understand the fire, one must first understand the ground that feeds it. Pennsylvania's anthracite region was once the powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution. Beneath the surface of towns like Centralia lay the Buck Mountain coal seam, a massive, dense vein of the highest quality coal on Earth. It was the lifeblood of the community. For generations, men went down into the dark to carve out a living, creating a labyrinth of tunnels that stretched for miles, crisscrossing and stacking on top of one another like a hive. By the early 1960s, many of these mines were abandoned, leaving behind a hollowed-out world of oxygen-rich voids and dry, brittle pillars of coal. In May of 1962, Centralia was a modest but proud community of about 1,400 people. Memorial Day was approaching, and the town council wanted the borough to look its best. This meant addressing a nagging problem, the local landfill. It was located in an abandoned strip mine pit, a jagged scar in the earth just a few hundred yards from the town's cemetery. The dump was full, and the smell was becoming an eyesore for the upcoming holiday. On May 27th, the council met to finalize a plan. The solution seemed standard for the era. They would burn the trash. It was a routine procedure, one they had performed in years past without incident. They hired 5 members of the volunteer fire company to oversee the burn. As the sun began to set, the match was struck. The refuse caught quickly, sending plumes of grey smoke into the Pennsylvania sky. They watched the flames consume the paper and wood, and once the surface fire seemed to have died down, they doused the embers with water. The town went to bed, believing the job was done. But beneath the cooling ash, something had changed. The ground didn't just hold the heat, it began to swallow it. 2 days later, the flames returned. The firemen were called back. They doused the pit again, saturating the debris until the surface was a slurry of grey mud. They left, satisfied. But a week later, the flames were back. Then again, a week after that. Each time the fire was extinguished, it would reappear days later in a different corner of the pit. It was during one of these routine dousings that a fireman noticed something unsettling. It wasn't just the trash that was smoking. A hole, about 15 feet wide, had opened at the base of the north wall of the pit. It wasn't filled with garbage. It was a direct portal into the abandoned labyrinth of the old mines. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. The fire wasn't just on the surface anymore. It had found a pathway. Using a flashlight, one of the men peered into the breach. He didn't see burning paper or household waste. He saw the faint, orange glow of coal. The fire had touched the Buck Mountain seam. In those early days of June 1962, there was no panic. Coal fires were not uncommon in Pennsylvania. Most were small, contained, and eventually smothered by the shifting earth or the lack of oxygen. The town council assumed the state would step in, provide some equipment, and seal the hole. They viewed it as an expensive nuisance, not an existential threat. But as the weeks turned into months, the behavior of the fire began to shift. It wasn't behaving like a typical mine fire. Usually, these fires moved slowly, starved of air. But the tunnels beneath Centralia were different. Decades of bootleg mining unregulated, private digging by locals during the Great Depression had left the earth honeycombed with illegal shafts that bypassed official maps. These shafts acted like chimneys, drawing fresh air from the surface and feeding the fire a constant supply of oxygen. By July, the smell in the town began to change. It was no longer the scent of burning wood or trash. It was the acrid, heavy stench of sulfur and carbon monoxide. It began to seep into the basements of houses closest to the dump. The council reached out to the Department of Mines. The response was a tangled web of bureaucracy. There were debates over who was responsible for the cost, which department held jurisdiction over an active landfill versus an abandoned mine, and whether the fire was technically out if there were no visible flames. While the officials argued, the fire was busy. It was moving. It was no longer a single point of heat. It was a front. It was creeping toward the town, traveling through the veins of coal that ran directly beneath the foundations of the houses. But as investigators began to look closer at the origin of the blaze, a disturbing question began to surface. Some records suggested that the landfill fire started on May 27th might not have been the true beginning. There are mentions in older borough records of a fire in that same pit a year earlier, in 1961. Some residents claimed they had seen smoke rising from the area long before the Memorial Day cleanup. There was a theory, whispered at first and then documented in later investigative reports, that the trash fire didn't start the mine fire. It simply unmasked it. The theory suggested that a fire had been smoldering deep within the abandoned shafts for years, a sleeper fire that finally found a vent to the surface when the landfill was cleared. If this was true, it meant the town council hadn't accidentally started a disaster. They had accidentally invited one that was already there to the surface. There is no clear consensus on this. The official version remains that the 1,962 burn was the catalyst. Yet, the speed with which the fire took hold, and the way it seemed to bypass initial containment efforts, left many wondering if they were fighting an enemy far older and more established than they realized. By the end of 1962, the first attempt to flush the mine with a mixture of crushed rock and water failed. The fire simply moved around the blockage. The state then tried to dig the fire out, but they underestimated the depth. As they dug, they exposed the glowing coal to even more oxygen, causing the fire to roar with renewed intensity. It was as if the earth itself was rejecting the cure. As the first winter approached, the residents of Centralia noticed something that felt like a scene from a Gothic novel. While the rest of the county was buried under snow, the ground in certain parts of Centralia remained warm to the touch. The snow would melt the moment it hit the grass. In the middle of December, some backyards remained green, fueled by a subterranean heat that shouldn't have been there. But the novelty soon turned to dread, because with the heat came the gas. And that's when things began to shift from a local problem to a slow-motion catastrophe. The silent threat of carbon monoxide is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of a mine fire. It is odorless, colorless, and tasteless. In the early 1970s, it began to seep through the floorboards of Centralia's homes. Families who had lived in the same houses for generations suddenly found themselves waking up with unexplained headaches, dizziness, and a strange, persistent lethargy. The state began installing gas monitors in the most affected homes. These weren't the sleek digital sensors of today. They were bulky, mechanical devices that hummed constantly, a rhythmic reminder that the very air was no longer certain. Some residents were told to keep their windows open, even in the dead of winter, creating a surreal sight. Families huddled in coats around their kitchen tables, while the bitter Pennsylvania wind whipped through their living rooms to keep the invisible poison at bay. But even as the alarms buzzed, a deep-seated denial took hold of the community. To acknowledge the fire was to acknowledge that their homes, their only real assets, were becoming worthless. A divide began to form, invisible but as real as the fissures in the road. There were those who demanded action, and those who insisted the danger was being exaggerated by outsiders and the media. This tension simmered for nearly 2 decades. The fire was a ghost story they lived with every day, a slow-moving predator that everyone hoped would simply run out of fuel. That hope evaporated in 1979. John Coddington owned a gas station on the main thoroughfare. It was a local landmark, a place of routine and familiarity. One afternoon, Coddington decided to check the fuel levels in his underground storage tanks. He lowered a wooden dipstick into the tank, expecting to find the usual level of gasoline. But when he pulled the stick back out, he didn't just see the wet line of fuel. He felt heat radiating from the wood. Puzzled, he lowered a thermometer into the tank. When he pulled it up, the reading was 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The realization was chilling. The fire hadn't just stayed in the abandoned shafts beneath the outskirts of town. It had traveled under the very heart of the business district. It was now cooking the earth beneath thousands of gallons of volatile gasoline. The town was, quite literally, sitting on a massive, subterranean bomb. The state acted quickly to remove the fuel, but the damage to the town's psyche was permanent. The hot gas station became a symbol of a battle that was being lost. The fire was no longer a localized problem at the dump. It was an invasive force that was rewriting the geography of the borough. Yet, even after the gas station incident, some historians believe the government's response remained inexplicably sluggish. There is no clear consensus on why more wasn't done in those critical years between 1979 and 1981. Some suggest the sheer cost of a total solution, a trench deep enough and long enough to cut off the coal seam, was so astronomical that state and federal officials simply hoped the fire would turn away on its own. What happened next, however, removed the luxury of waiting. On Valentine's Day, 1981, 12-year-old Todd Donoski was playing in his grandmother's backyard. It was a cold, overcast morning. To Todd, the ground looked as solid as it always had. But as he walked toward a plume of steam rising from the grass, the earth beneath his feet didn't just crack, it vanished. A sinkhole, 4 feet wide and 150 feet deep, opened instantly. Todd managed to grab onto a protruding tree root, dangling over a void filled with a lethal concentration of carbon monoxide and swirling heat. His cousin, Eric Wolfgang, heard his cries and ran to the edge, reaching down to pull Todd from the mouth of the abyss. When state officials arrived to inspect the hole, they lowered a probe. The temperature at the bottom was over 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The gases swirling in the dark were enough to kill a person in seconds. The image of a child nearly swallowed by the earth was the breaking point. The narrative of Centralia shifted overnight from a geological curiosity to a federal emergency. The national media descended. Film crews captured the surreal imagery of steam rising from the snow and the danger signs that began to proliferate like weeds. In the wake of the Donoski incident, the federal government conducted a massive study. They looked at every possible way to stop the fire. They considered pumping millions of gallons of water into the mines, but the steam would have likely caused massive explosions and further destabilized the ground. They considered smothering it with fly ash, but the labyrinth was too vast, the air sources too numerous. The conclusion of the report was a death sentence for the town. The fire could not be put out, at least not with the technology available and the budget provided. The only way to stop it would be to dig a trench so vast it would require the relocation of the entire community anyway. In 1983, the United States Congress appropriated $42 million for a voluntary relocation program. The choice was put to the people of Centralia: stay and live atop a burning furnace, or take a buyout and watch your history be bulldozed. This wasn't just a logistical challenge, it was a psychological trauma. For many of the elderly residents, their homes were their entire world. They had survived the collapse of the mining industry, the Great Depression, and the harshness of Appalachian winters. They couldn't understand how an invisible fire could be more powerful than their right to remain on their own land. Some residents claimed the fire was being used as a pretext. A rumor began to circulate, one that persists in some circles to this day, that the state didn't actually want to save the town. Some believed the real goal was to clear the residents so the state could eventually seize the mineral rights to the massive anthracite coal seams still sitting beneath the fire. Records suggest there is little evidence to support a grand conspiracy of mineral theft, as the fire itself makes the coal nearly impossible to mine safely. However, the lack of transparency in the buyout process and the aggressive nature of the later eminent domain filings left a bitter taste that never washed away. As the 1980s progressed, the town began to disappear in slow motion. One by one, houses were sold to the government. Once a family moved out, the windows were boarded up, and shortly after, the structure was leveled. The goal was to remove the fuel for any potential surface fires and to prevent squatters from moving into the danger zone. But even as the houses vanished, the fire grew bolder. In the early 1990s, the heat beneath Route 61 became so intense that the state was forced to close a nearly mile-long stretch of the highway. The asphalt had become a twisted landscape of humps and valleys. In some places, the cracks were wide enough for a person to fall into. The state built a bypass, leaving the old road to be reclaimed by the fire and the forest. This stretch of road, later dubbed the Graffiti Highway, became a haunting monument to the disaster. But while tourists began to visit to see the smoke, the remaining residents, the few dozen who refused the buyouts, were living in a ghost town that was becoming increasingly dangerous. What happened next remains unclear in terms of legal precedent. In 1992, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania declared eminent domain on every single property in the borough. They officially revoked the town's zip code. They removed the Centralia signs from the highways. The government was trying to erase a place that still had people living in it. The holdouts, led by a fierce sense of independence, took the state to court. They argued that their homes were safe, that the fire was moving away from their specific streets, and that they had a right to die where they were born. The battle lasted for 20 years. It was a standoff between a group of aging citizens and the unstoppable momentum of a government that wanted the liability of Centralia to go away. But as the court cases dragged on, the fire continued its silent migration. It was no longer where it had been in 1962. It was following the seams of coal, branching out like the roots of a tree. It moved under the cemetery. It moved toward the neighboring town of Burnsville. And then the fire did something no one expected. It began to change the very chemistry of the ground above it. Burnsville was a small collection of houses just down the road, a satellite community that shared Centralia's history but lacked its name recognition. As the fire moved south, Burnsville became the collateral damage of the 1962 disaster. By the mid-1980s, the heat and gas that had plagued Centralia arrived there too. But unlike its neighbor, Burnsville didn't have the political weight to fight. The residents were moved out, the houses were leveled, and today, only a few cracked concrete steps in the tall grass remain. It was a preview of what was coming for the larger borough. While the human drama played out in courtrooms and town hall meetings, the landscape itself began to mutate. The heat from the fire didn't just kill the trees, it created a bizarre, localized microclimate. In the middle of the Pennsylvania woods, observers began to notice patches of ground where the native flora had been replaced by species that shouldn't have been there. In some areas, heat-loving grasses and mosses thrived in the dead of winter, nourished by the steam venting from the fissures. Biologists who visited the area discovered something even more peculiar. Deep within the heated soil, certain types of bacteria and fungi were flourishing strains that are usually only found near volcanic vents or deep-sea thermal openings. The fire had turned the Appalachian hills into a laboratory for extreme life. It was a reminder that while the fire was a disaster for human habitation, it was simply a change in energy for the earth. But for the remaining residents of Centralia, the fire was an intruder that refused to leave. By the late 1990s, the town was a grid of empty streets. The streetlights still flickered on at night, illuminating vacant lots where houses once stood. The sidewalks led to nowhere. The most haunting sight was the row of buttress chimneys, massive brick supports left standing to keep the remaining houses from collapsing after their neighbors had been torn down. In 2013, the decades-long legal battle finally reached a quiet, somber conclusion. A settlement was reached between the state and the last 7 residents. They were granted the right to live out the rest of their lives in their homes, after which the properties would be taken by the state and the structures demolished. It was a life estate agreement, a pact that ensured the town would officially die with its last inhabitant. Today, only a handful of people remain. They live in a silence that is difficult to describe. There are no mail deliveries. There are no trash pickups. The borough of Centralia has been legally disincorporated. It is a place that exists in the physical world but has been erased from the administrative one. For years, the most visible symbol of this purgatory was the abandoned stretch of Route 61, known globally as the Graffiti Highway. After it was closed in the 90s, it became a canvas for thousands of visitors who came to leave their mark on the buckled asphalt. It was a place of pilgrimage for the curious, the rebellious, and the bored. The smoke rising from the cracks in the colorful pavement created an apocalyptic aesthetic that felt like a scene from a movie. But in April 2020, even that monument was taken away. Under the cover of the global pandemic, the company that owned the land brought in hundreds of truckloads of dirt. They buried the Graffiti Highway under a mountain of earth, citing concerns over liability and the crowds that ignored social distancing. The road is gone now, replaced by a long brown mound of soil that is slowly being reclaimed by weeds. Yet, burying the road did nothing to stop the fire. The most recent geological surveys suggest that the fire is no longer a single concentrated mass. It has fractured. It is moving along multiple fronts, following the richest veins of anthracite deep into the mountain. Some geologists believe the fire has enough fuel to burn for another 250 years. Others suggest that as it moves deeper, it may eventually hit the water table or run out of oxygen, but there is no clear consensus on when or if that will happen. What remains today is a landscape of contradictions. There is the Holy Dormition Orthodox Church, standing on a hill overlooking the empty town, its white walls and blue domes pristine against the backdrop of a dying forest. It remains active, a sentinel watching over a congregation that no longer lives nearby. Below it, the cemeteries are still meticulously maintained, though the ground beneath the headstones is, in some places, noticeably warm. There are still questions that haunt the survivors and the historians who study the site. Was it truly a trash fire that started it all? Or was the 1962 burn just the trigger for a fire that had been smoldering since the 19th century? Some local lore suggests that a fire in the 1930s was never truly extinguished, merely forgotten. There are those who point to the Molly Maguires, a secret society of Irish coal miners in the 1800s, and wonder if the legends of their curses on the land held some poetic, if not literal, truth. Then there is the question of the mineral rights. While conspiracy theories about the state stealing coal have largely been debunked by the sheer cost and danger of the fire, the legal status of the land remains a tangle of complexity. When the last resident passes away and the last house is leveled, the ground will belong to the Commonwealth. What happens then remains unclear. Will it be turned into a state park? Will it be left to revert to wilderness? Or will the fire eventually do what humans could not and consume the mountain entirely? For now, Centralia is a place of memory and vapor. If you stand in the center of what used to be the business district, you can hear the wind whistling through the vents in the earth. You can smell the sulfur, a reminder that the engine of the Industrial Revolution is still running, fueled by the very coal that built the town. The story of Centralia isn't just about a fire. It's about the fragility of the things we think are permanent zip codes, property lines, the ground beneath our feet. It is a reminder that we are merely guests on a planet that is constantly shifting, burning, and reclaiming itself. As the sun sets over the ridge, the steam from the vents turns a ghostly orange, catching the last of the light. Down in the dark, the fire continues its slow, methodical crawl. It doesn't care about the lawsuits, the buried highways, or the maps that no longer show its name. It only knows the coal. And as long as there is coal, the fire will keep breathing.